All right, get this. The year is 1974. News starts spreading about something unbelievable. A soldier from World War II just walked out of a jungle to surrender. A wild story, right? But believe me, that's not even the wildest part.
So yeah, 1974. A man named Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda from the Imperial Japanese Army officially hands over his sword on this little island in the Philippines called Lubang. He's finally surrendering from a war that for pretty much everyone else on the planet had ended almost 30 years ago.
I mean, think about it. The war, World War II, officially ended way back in 1945. That's when Japan surrendered. But not for Onoda. For him, the fight had just kept on going, for something like 10,000 more nights.
So that's the big question here, right? How on earth does a soldier just keep fighting a war for 29 years after it's over? What was going on in his head? And, what was it like for the people who had to live on that island with him?
Well, the answer, it's not as simple as just saying he was some kind of fanatic. It really all goes back to his training, which was different, super elite, and it all boils down to one single, unbreakable order he was given back in 1944.
See, Onoda wasn't your average grunt. He was specially selected for this place called the Nakano Military School, which was a big deal. Most Japanese soldiers at the time had this code, die with honor before you surrender. But Onoda's training, it was the complete opposite. He was explicitly told, do not die, do not surrender. Your job is to stay alive no matter what, and just keep causing trouble for the enemy, forever if you have to.
And get this. These were the final words from his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. This wasn't just some standard mission briefing. For Onoda, these words became everything. Like a psychological prison he couldn't break out of for the next 29 years.
So with that one command basically burned into his brain, Onoda and 3 of his men just disappeared into the jungle. For the next 30 years, the world outside heard almost nothing. Just these whispers and rumors that created this legend of the ultimate unwavering soldier.
But one by one, his small group started to fall apart. First, in 1950, one of his men, Private Akatsu, just gave up and surrendered. This actually made the others even more paranoid. They figured he'd been captured and was now some kind of double agent. A few years later, Corporal Shimada was killed in a firefight. Then, much later, in 1972, his very last companion, Private Kazuka, was killed by police. And just like that, for 2 whole years, Onoda was utterly alone.
So, you're probably thinking, didn't anyone try to tell this guy the war was over? And the answer is, oh yeah, they absolutely did. Right away, planes started dropping leaflets all over the island announcing Japan's surrender. But here's the thing, this is where that special training of his became a real problem.
Remember, Onoda was trained in propaganda. He knew all the tricks of psychological warfare. So when he saw these leaflets, his brain didn't think, oh, the war's over. It thought, a very clever enemy trick. He and his men decided that every single leaflet, without exception, was just enemy propaganda.
But the attempts to reach him just got more and more intense. Search parties would leave things for him to find, like current newspapers and magazines. They even left personal letters and family photos, all to prove the war was well and truly finished.
And to him, it was all just a more elaborate trap. That photo of his family's rebuilt home? A fake. They even got his own brother to call out to him on a loudspeaker, and Onoda just dismissed it as a recording of an imposter. That one order he received had built this mental wall that nothing, absolutely nothing, could get through.
And his body was just as tough as his mind. He was a master of survival, lived on bananas, coconuts, and, by stealing cattle from local farms. He kept himself incredibly clean, so much so that when a doctor finally examined him after 30 years in a jungle, the guy had 0 cavities. And his gear, his rifle, his sword, his ammo, all perfectly maintained, always ready for a fight he was sure was just around the corner.
So it's an amazing survival story, no doubt. But this is where that heroic image really starts to fall apart, because while Onoda was playing the part of the perfect soldier, the actual people living on Lubang Island were enduring a nightmare. For them, this wasn't about some noble duty. It was 30 years of fear. Over those 29 years he was at war, it's estimated that Onoda and his men killed about 30 Filipino civilians. And let's be clear, these were not enemy soldiers. These were farmers, regular people just trying to live their lives, and some local police. And on top of the people they killed, they wounded around 100 more.
So this whole idea of him just hiding in the jungle waiting, that's not what happened. This was an active, violent campaign against the people who lived there.
This quote here is pretty telling. It's from the guy who actually ghost-wrote Onoda's own famous memoir. After helping build this heroic story, the writer, Tsuda Shin, felt he had to publish another book to set the record straight. He said that in private, Onoda told him stories that were clearly about ambushing and murdering islanders who weren't a threat at all.
So what you have are two completely different stories that just don't add up. Onodada's version, the one in his book, talks about defensive fights against enemy patrols. But the people of Lubang, they tell a story of an aggressive war against them. The enemy combatants he mentions, unarmed farmers. The military supplies he took, that was just looting, and it devastated their economy for decades.
So the end of this whole saga isn't just about him finally surrendering. It's really about how the world tried to make sense of these two completely opposite versions of the same man, the devoted soldier and the killer.
And the way he surrendered was just as strange as his war. A young Japanese explorer, a guy named Norio Suzuki, finally found him, but even then, Onoda wouldn't surrender. He was completely serious. I will not stand down until I get a direct order from my old commander, Major Taniguchi. So you're not going to believe this. The Japanese government actually had to track down his old boss, who is now just a regular guy running a bookstore, and fly him all the way to the Philippines just to officially tell Onoda, hey, your mission is over.
And what happened next was complicated. Back in Japan, he was welcomed home like a hero. People saw him as this symbol of old-school loyalty and duty. But in the Philippines, just anger. The president at the time, Ferdinand Marcos, gave him a full pardon, which was basically a political decision. And this, of course, was a slap in the face to the people of Lubang, who never got any justice, never got any compensation for everything they lost.
Onoda did write a memoir that became a bestseller, but he had a really hard time fitting back in. The Japan he came back to was totally different. It was modern, it was pacifist. The values he'd given his entire adult life for seemed to be gone. In fact, just a year after coming home, he left. He moved to Brazil, of all places, and became a cattle rancher, trying to find some peace in a world he didn't recognize anymore.
When you boil it all down, Onoda's story leaves us with this really tough question. If you judge him by the orders he was given, he was the perfect soldier. He followed them to the letter. But that same perfect dedication turned him into a monster for an entire community for 30 years. So it makes you wonder, when one person's sense of duty becomes another's living hell, who gets to decide what the truth is? Who gets to write the history?